The other thing that I was going to mention, I was going to refer to something you said, David, as the analytic objection that just takes the past to be things that have already happened. And from talking many times with a fancy physicist that Barry might, philosopher physicist, philosopher of physics that Barry might have had in mind, Tim Maudlin, mutual friend. I have the sense that he's one of these people that he thinks of time as really just something that's very fundamental and cannot be analyzed further. So I imagine that he objects to some of this, but
He objects to all of it. It's a whole other approach. We can talk about that at some point if you want, but he doesn't give an analytic answer to this question. He has a kind of metaphysics answer to the question about time. It's not a matter of meaning.
it's
Right,
not.
but he does think, I mean, Barry is really the one who at a certain point explained Tim's view to Tim in a way that I know was very helpful to Tim and clarified things a lot for Tim. And maybe Barry wants to elaborate on that. But yes, Tim thinks that, I mean, Barry's right. It's not exactly analytic, but it is true that Tim would endorse a claim like, of course you can't affect the past. It's the past, okay?
Right,
And
that's where
of
I'm
course the
getting at.
past is the only thing that you remember. It's the past,
But
okay?
he has a metaphysical explanation for it.
I mean, so talk about that a little, Barry.
So, you mentioned before we began that you're about to talk to Tim and Shelley. They will disagree with a lot of what we had to say. It won't be fair unless we're there to fight fair and square.
But I think he's going to talk to Tim and Shelley about Bohm's theory.
That's right. So
Isn't that right?
this might not come up, but they disagree about how to think about probability and how to think about laws. But connected to what you were just bringing up about time, Tim thinks that time is fundamentally metaphysically different from space. So when David was bringing up this issue about, look, you'd be really puzzled if you could somehow influence things to your left, but not to your right. You want a physical explanation of that. Tim would want a physical explanation of that too. But about the past, he has a metaphysical explanation. It's that time passes. He thinks time flows in some way. Well, he doesn't like it like that, because when I pressed him on that, he thinks that time, unlike space, has a built-in directionality in it. And that's needed in order to make sense of his conception of laws. But this is really a long discussion, which I've had, and it's in the journals between me and Tim and other people too. And there are arguments on both sides of this issue, but we're not going to get into this right now. But he has a metaphysical account that time, by its very nature, has a directionality in it, and it's that directionality that's going to explain these asymmetries of time. And
Anyway, I mean, just shortly, Robinson, you're absolutely right that Tim is someone who represents a profoundly different approach to these matters than the one we're discussing here.
And Shelley, Shelley is, I think, most of the time he goes along with a Tim view about laws and stuff. He definitely has a view about typicality being more fundamental than probability, something I want to say a word or two more about in just a second. But then he gets into an argument. We get into a big discussion. He can be pulled in the more Humean direction. And then he says, "Yeah, what do you want from me? I'm a mathematician." He's a very good mathematician and a good philosopher too. Can I go back to the bit about when David was talking about most? David was motivating Boltzmann with the idea that a majority of the microstates, most of them, will behave in the normal way in one temporal direction and in an abnormal way in the other temporal direction. That's why we introduced the past hypothesis But instead of talking about most, we introduce a probability distribution. I think that's the way to go. But a whole other approach just wants to take the notion of most as being more fundamental, because they recognize they got to go measure theoretic about that as well. I'm sorry, I live in a neighborhood where there's a fire station 2 blocks away. Can you hear that?
Actually, we can't.
Oh, good. Okay. Hearing my ears. Um, uh, so, so they think to explain thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, and a bunch else, they want to make use of the notion of typicality rather than probability. I just want to give a nod in that direction and just put it aside, just so your listeners know we're well aware of it and we all argue about this all the time. But it's really for another podcast.